Welcome to the brighter side of education, research, innovation, and resources. I'm your host, Dr. Lisa Hassler, here to enlighten and brighten the classrooms in America through focused conversation on important topics in education. In each episode, I discuss problems we as teachers and parents are facing and what people are doing in their communities to fix it. What are the variables, and how can we duplicate it to maximize student outcomes? Today's focus is on childhood trauma and teacher support. Childhood trauma can occur when students witness or experience a frightening, dangerous, violent, or life-threatening event between the ages of 0 and 18. However, not all overwhelming and life-threatening experiences are considered traumatic, as children interpret their unique experiences differently. A life event that is traumatic for one child might not be traumatic for another. Trauma can be better understood and defined through the 3 E's of trauma: event, experience, and effect. Another related term is adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. The ACE study is an ongoing research project exploring the relationship between childhood trauma and long-term medical, health, and social consequences. Results show that approximately 65% of children experience at least one adverse event during their childhood, and nearly 40% 2 or more ACEs. Now, the study found that the greater the number of ACEs a child is exposed to, the higher their risk of developing physical and mental health problems throughout their life. Trauma-informed teaching involves a set of classroom practices that teachers can use to mitigate the impact of trauma on student learning. Studies have found that students exposed to these strategies are better able to regulate their emotions, build resilience, achieve greater academic results, and maintain better attention in class. It begins with understanding what trauma is and how it affects the student's emotions, behavior, and learning, enabling teachers to respond to students' needs and create safe and supportive learning environments. Today, we are honored to welcome Dr. Robyn Koslowitz, a nationally recognized clinical psychologist and expert in childhood trauma and resilience. Dr. Koslowitz has been a licensed school psychologist since 2002 and a licensed clinical psychologist since 2017. She holds a master's degree in school psychology and a PhD in school clinical child psychology from New York University. In addition to her clinical work, Dr. Koslowitz is a parenting educator and the host of the Post-Traumatic Parenting podcast. She brings a wealth of experience from her previous roles as a 3rd and 4th grade teacher. Robyn joins us today to share her invaluable insights, personal journey, and to discuss her forthcoming book, Post-Traumatic Parenting. Welcome, Robyn. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I am so excited to talk about, I think, the 2 topics that I'm passionate about, which is post-traumatic parenting and trauma-informed education, because those are my absolute passions in life.
Can you share your personal journey and how it led you to becoming an expert on childhood trauma and resilience?
Yeah, so I was a kid having the regular trajectory of life. I had a very kind of chronically ill parent growing up, and my father actually died under very traumatic circumstances when I was in high school. And then fast forward to me being in graduate school. And unlike my classmates at NYU, where people were very focused and they really had their research interests and everything that they were doing kind of synchronized, I found myself studying so many different things. I was studying kids who were acting out. In the clinic I was working with, I actually was working with kids who had encopresis and enuresis, kids who couldn't control their bowels. And I was also at my research lab doing research in child temperament. And I remember thinking, why am I so all over the place? Like everybody else is studying cutting in 35-year-olds or Piagetian cognitive development concepts in 4th graders. Like everyone was like so consistent and I'm all over the map. And it suddenly hit me that what I'm really studying is the impact of trauma on child development and how it impacts parenting. Because as a young mom, I had this one major question, which is I know I have PTSD. I know that I have like the full-blown condition. How is my PTSD going to impact my children?
Right.
And being a research geek, I went to the books because that's what you do. And there was nothing. There was no research on this topic.
Wow.
And it suddenly hit me like a bolt out of the blue, like, oh, I'm studying the impact of trauma on child development and parenting. That's what I'm trying to do because I'm trying to write the book that I would like to read.
That's amazing because it really takes such inward insight to reflect on your own patterns and interests to see why something's so broad and yet so narrow at the same time because it's so very specific to you, and then how you're able to help others through that research. So, what kind of signs then do children exhibit? What kind of warning signs should parents and teachers be noticing?
So I think the first thing is before we even go into science, because I think that's important, I think the first thing we have to do is demystify the fact that children do become traumatized, even children who seem to be fine on the surface. Because a lot of times it's not about looking for the signs, it's about not looking for the signs. Like this child went through a traumatic experience. They are traumatized. The fact that they look fine on the surface is absolutely meaningless. I very often in my practice, because I treat a lot of traumatized kids, I call it being a duck. A duck, looks so serene on the surface of the water and they're just sort of like floating
Yeah,
there. And then under the water, their legs are pedaling furiously.
right.
And we only look at the surface. So we have to know that if a child experienced a traumatic event, and we're going to know that, if the community experienced a traumatic event and the child was part of that community, like there was a school shooting in the community, or even a child in the school, maybe a few grades away, died of suddenly or died of cancer, or there was something, the assumption has to be that that experience was too big for the kid's brain to metabolize, even if they seem fine. We don't want to assume that they're fine because if you looked at me when I was in high school, my way of handling trauma is I become more productive. I hyper focus on work because I'm good at work. I'm a geek. I'm good at research. So if you look at Freud's definition of success in life, to live, love, and work, like I was working, I was getting straight A's. I was the captain of like the service team in my school. We had like a community service organization. I was the president of it and I was on the honor roll and I had friends. On every level, I looked fine. I was so very not fine. But no one thought to say, oh, but is she really fine? Because I looked fine. So I almost feel like when we look for the signs, if the signs aren't there, we think, oh, the child's fine.
Hmm.
If we define trauma as an experience that's too big for the brain to metabolize, which is how I like to look at trauma,
Yeah.
then if an experience happened that you would say that is too big for a brain to metabolize, then it's our job to sort of help them digest it.
Okay.
And then there are also signs. Obviously, when you see a sudden change in a child, when you see mysterious behavior patterns that don't make sense,
Right.
so to me, when a child is being defiant, when a child is, has every indicator that they could be successful in school, and yet they're not, to me, that's one of two things. There's either an invisible skill that's lacking. I was just in a school today consulting, and there's a young man who has an IQ that's off the charts. It's literally untestable. I've tested a lot of kids. I have never tested a kid this bright.
Wow.
And he wasn't even an evaluation case of me. I just wanted to satisfy my own curiosity. So I pulled out the Stanford Binet and I was trying one of the more challenging subtests. He ceilinged out, meaning there were no more questions to ask him, and he still was doing well.
Wow.
But the very basics of how to read a situation, he didn't have. This child is on the spectrum, so we have a neurodiversity issue. So there we have a situation where it's like he lacks the skill to handle this. But if it
Right.
wasn't that, if he was neurotypical, and yet we're seeing these baffling behaviors that just doesn't make sense, we're going to assume that something is lacking that child's ability to be successful. If it isn't a skills deficit, then we're looking at trauma.
Okay. That makes sense.
And that's what I'm always looking at. Do you get this? Like seriously looking at this boy and saying, like, in the words of Dale Carnegie, do you know how to win friends and influence people? No, you do not. That's because we're dealing with a neuroatypicality. Okay, we're going to teach you then how to win friends and influence people, because then you will do well in life. And if you can do that in a way that speaks to someone with that level of an IQ, you can do that. But if not, if there's no neuroatypicality that's causing this, then, and very often when that happens and I'm consulting in a school, I'll say something and the person will say, oh yeah, well, I mean, his grandma was his primary caregiver. Like she was basically the parent in the home. She died 2 years ago, but he handled that fine. So one of two things, either no, he didn't,
Right.
and now you're starting to see it, or sometimes trauma actually happens in the future, not the past. So what happens is your brain has to hit the developmental stage to comprehend what happened to you. And then you first become traumatized. So maybe grandma died when he was 6 and he didn't understand the permanence of death. But now he's 8.5 and his brain can comprehend permanence.
Oh.
And suddenly he's traumatized because it just happened. Grandma did not actually die 2 years ago. Grandma died yesterday because his brain finally caught up to what happened.
I never thought about it that way. That makes so much sense.
Right? And then we say they're being manipulative.
Those things happen so often. You would wonder, well, yes, this did happen, but it was a while ago. And so now it must be something new, something different, something current. I'd never thought about the brain catching up to that when it comes to developmentally being aware of a concept like death.
It also sometimes is something new in consonance with something that happened in the past. I consult in some high schools and I had a girl who had lost, I feel like she lost her mother maybe like in 3rd grade. She came into 9th grade and suddenly she's saying things to teachers like, well, I couldn't do my paper because I was really sad because my mother died. And the teacher thinking like this happened last week. And then the school had this idea that she's being manipulative, like she's using her story to get away with something.
Right.
Where I'm able to look at the teacher and say, she's in a new situation. So it's new and unfamiliar. So she feels vulnerable and unsafe and unsure of her capacity to handle things. Maybe she's hearing friends say, yeah, so my mom and I sat down and we figured out a plan for this term paper together. And it suddenly hit her that she doesn't have a mom to do that with. And now it's happening. Maybe her mother didn't die in 3rd grade. Maybe her mother died yesterday.
Yeah.
Right? So it's the new stressor coupled with the old fact together.
Yes.
That now she's traumatized. And I actually, in that situation, sat down with the kid who I had never met before. And I asked her, I said, like, tell me about what's going on. And it's literally what she said. Like, the principal was shocked that I like predicted it. She's like, I'm in high school now. And my friends' mothers are picking them up, or they're going out, or there's like one of the clubs in the school is having like a mother-daughter brunch. And I have who to invite. Like, I'll invite my aunt. But I don't have a mother. It's hitting her now. It was something about the transition from elementary school to high school and maybe her brain maturing and becoming an adolescent.
Yeah.
That she was processing it now. So when the school understood that this is not an attempt at manipulation, this is something else entirely, their entire focus on her changed. Because the principal was going like, I believe in tough love and accountability, and we're not going to do her any favors if we let her go down this path. I said, I believe in accountability.
Mm-hmm.
I believe in love. I believe in making people be responsible within the level that their brain is capable of handling. This is above that level.
Yeah.
And right, trauma is too big for your brain to metabolize. This is too big.
When those things happen, you do some target teaching with teachers. Let's say you have this child and they've had this trauma. I could only imagine how distracting and how difficult it is to be able to focus on learning when things like that are going through your brain and you're being brought into this trauma zone where maybe you're thinking about like, oh, they're talking about their mom and I'm sitting here and I'm supposed to be learning about addition and all I can think about is how I don't have my mom right now. How does a teacher cope with that when it comes to helping that child be able to learn and stay focused?
It's such a good question. I find that kids actually do very well when you explain that to them. When you say to a child, we want to stress you out to the point that you grow. That analogy of how a muscle grows, right? We mildly rip the muscle fiber so that more muscle fiber comes.
Yes.
Even 3rd graders can get that, but high school kids can definitely get that. I want to stress you out a little bit. I want you to be in that zone of, I'm trying, kind of failing, trying again. Now I got it. I want you to be in that learning zone. But when you're in that stress zone where it's too much, I need you to be able to signal to me so that we can figure something out, so that we can come up with a plan. And then depending on the kid, we can individualize a plan of what we're going to do. So then the child has to know, because if I help you with every little thing, then you never learn how to handle adversity. But when it's too big for you, you need to be able to tell me that. When there's something on your brain, and I consult with a lot of schools, and I had a school where a 3rd grade class where the teacher was really having a hard time engaging them. And there was just like the class was all over the place. And there were a lot of kids coping with some serious adversity. The simplest thing that we switched was this idea that if anybody has something a little too big on their brain that's making it hard to learn, during the first like 10 minutes of the day, like after the teacher did whatever she did to start the day, if you need to, you can go to the back of the room. There's an MP3 player. You can talk into like this recorder. You can talk your too big worry into it. And then you can go down and then you can go back to your seat. And the teacher is going to listen to it at some point. It became not even in the day, it became some point in the week. And we're two third grade classrooms. One teacher was like, this, they're just going to be silly. Like they're going to whistle into it. They're going to this, that. The other teacher's like, we're going to try it. So she was willing to try. And yeah, you had one or two kids who blew off a little steam by making weird animal noises into the MP3 player and then sitting back down. Great. So you got to play with the system. I don't mind. Play with the system. This is what I want you to do. Hey, if you make some weird farting sounds into the MP3 player and then you sit down and then you're like ready to learn, fabulous. Right? Like
you got that out.
Yeah, with farting noises. I don't care. And then kids were saying their worries, and we taught them this idea that you can sort of put your worries into a box, focus on what's going on in class, and then you tell that part of you, like, now I can check in with you later. And then during social and emotional learning, we talked about the idea that whatever that worry was that you set into the box, do you have an adult that you can go to with that? Who are your adults in school if it's a school-based issue? Who are your adults at home? And here and there, we figured out there were one or two kids who didn't have an adult at home. And then that meant now we know exactly how to refer them because like, oh, this kid needs much more support. We need to get the school counselor involved because they're saying, well, I would talk to my mom, but she's so stressed out about the divorce that like if I tell her anything upsetting about the girl who's making fun of me and won't sit next to me at recess, I'll stress her out too much.
Yeah.
So, okay. That's why we have school counselors. Like you just referred yourself.
I think that sometimes teachers, they're looking at an issue and they're wondering, is this something that I can handle on my own? How do you know when it is too big for you and you need to go to the counselor or you need to bring in a professional into that situation to be able to help that traumatized child?
So I think the more we bring that social and emotional learning into the classroom where the kids themselves are learning about their stress response, they're understanding the idea of zones of regulation, they're understanding how emotions function, they get all of that. They know how to lower an uncomfortable emotion if they need to, how to raise a positive emotion if they need to. Like they understand their own brains. Like I call it the science of me, right? Like that's what we're learning.
Okay.
I had this in a school where the principal's very into his fundamentals and he's like, well, we teach like reading, writing, math. I was like, psychology is a science. It's a soft science, but it's a science.
Right.
Trust me, I have a PhD from NYU. They teach stuff there. Like we don't flower arrange, right? Like psychology is a science. This is psychology. We're going to learn how our brains work.
Yeah.
The more we know how our brains work, the more we know how our bodies work, the more we can take ownership of that information. When a child says, I get all of that and I still can't, that's when we say, okay, you need a professional.
Okay.
So I try an intervention with a kid who's a perfectionist. And I say, you know what you're going to do is we all agree. So no one's going to be judging you. The teacher's giving out 10 math examples. You're only allowed to do 8 of them. And one of them has to be intentionally wrong. And one of them has to be written in green crayon, right? Whatever. And the kid's like, I totally get it. The Mr. Worry in my brain is bossing me around. And I don't want to let Mr. Worry, that kid actually, it was Professor Perfectionist. So like Professor Perfectionist is bossing me around. So this was something I advised the teacher to do, like not as a therapist, as a school consultant. So, Professor Perfectionist is bossing me around. I'm going to boss her around. I tried. I can't do it.
Oh.
All right. Now we need a professional because if it's too big for me to handle, then we need a professional. If that intervention, like Professor Perfectionist and the teacher giving silly ideas of like, you're going to mess up, you're going to write it backwards, and the kid can do it, great. Then that's within the classroom setting, provided, of course, that we're freeing the teacher up to have an individual relationship with her students. If you have a teacher who's going from classroom to classroom with 60 kids in the class and she has 30 minutes to teach math, then we're not setting her or the kids up for success.
No, you're not going to be able to have that connection or know your students well enough to be able to have those types of conversations and be aware of what is different for them when it comes to their behavior.
Right.
I had a child whose father had died, and every once in a while something would happen and he would get so angry. And then, as you would approach him, he would go to the back of the room, sit in the corner, and just cry. And you couldn't even go near him. So at that point, we would just allow him to have that space and calm down. And he was able to rejoin the classroom when he knew he was calm again. But at that point, how does a teacher regain control of a class when something like that has happened? What kind of things would you recommend?
So I think we make this mistake of thinking like kids don't notice things, right? I like to talk about elephants in the room. So saying it looks like James's emotions got way too big for his body, we're going to give him time. And what I like to do, how I cue kids to get their attention back is show me without words that you're interested in what I have to say.
Oh,
Right. And then like automatically shoulders go up, back and down, whatever. And then I say, now show me that you're interested in what I have to say on steroids. And then I teach them to like sparkle their eyes at me.
oh,
That now
yeah,
really show me. And I do that. I always do this idea where I want to give ownership to the kids. So I always say to them, you think that your teacher teaches you, but you actually teach your teacher. Because when you sit there and you look like you're ready to learn and you sparkle your eyes, then you're teaching me that you are a student that I want to engage with, that you want to learn. When a kid says to me, my teacher plays favorites, I say, okay, did you teach her that you're her favorite yet? It's on you to teach her that. You can teach her that. You sparkle your eyes at her and you sit there in class with a listening posture. Most teachers, will there be some outliers who honestly went into teaching for all the wrong reasons? Of course. I can't account for all of that. But on the whole, most teachers teach because they really like teaching kids. So
yeah.
you teach her to like you, she will like you. So I say that to the class. I say, we're going to give him the space to contain his emotions. The rest of us, you're going to show me without words that you're interested, and you're going to do him the respect of giving him his space. And then I would have a
Right.
conversation with him about everything he did right in that situation. You were really mad. Your mad got so big. And instead of lashing out and hurting someone, you went to the back of the room. You made that really good choice.
Right.
That's amazing. That's an amount of self-regulation that some grown-ups don't have.
So how can social emotional learning then be a factor that prevents a stressful situation from becoming traumatic?
So I like to really have kids understand their stress response and understand the idea that when something's stressful, it's not dangerous, right? We have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. When it's dangerous is when it feels too big, too much, too fast, and I'm all alone in coping with it. If I have those factors, that means I need the help of someone else. And there's no shame in that. That means, like, if I'm smart, I'm going to get help. When I'm dealing with something that's too big, too much, too fast, the first thing I do is outsource some of it, right? I try to like recruit help. That's my go-to strategy. So when we teach them their brains and they get it, then they can say that back to us. Like they can say, I was feeling kind of overwhelmed, so I pushed off starting this project and now I'm really behind. What should I do about it? When they know that, it doesn't lead to the level, this is too much and I just give up and I can't and it's so noxious and I'm just running away, because they have words to put on their experience. The idea of having like a mixed emotion, the idea of feeling, less than or not good enough compared to the other kids, the more they have words for that, or even like the social skill of how do I resolve a problem with a friend? I have a technique of 5 ways you can answer back when people are starting relational aggression, where they're starting to mess with you, and you want to keep it at the level of a game before it becomes bullying, right? So I look at it as a game of tennis. You serve the ball to me, I want to serve the ball right back to you.
Yeah.
So there's a serve and return. So you threw that comment out at me, and I immediately had a response to throw it back to you. And we kept it at that playful level. So it never turned into the fist fight and the I'm being bullied and no one in the grade likes me and no one wants to sit next to me, because we kept it at that level. The more they know this stuff, the less we have to deal with like power struggles, classroom dynamics, the undercurrent of tension in the room because there was some sort of a fight at recess. And now we're sitting and like nobody's ready. When I notice an undercurrent of tension in a room, when I come in to do social emotional learning in schools, I ask the kids, like, sounds like there's stuff on people's minds. What's going on? Let's clear the air. And then we have 2 options. We can clear the air and put the worries away and focus. We can resolve this right now, or we can make our bodies feel better to make our brains ready for learning. What do you guys want to do? Those are always your 3 options.
How do you make your bodies feel better to be able to move on without talking about it?
So movement, right? Like we're going to do jumping jacks until we're out of breath. And then we're going to breathe in for 4, hold for 4, and blow out as far in the ABC as I can get. Right? We're going to do a lion face and then we're going to relax. We're going to do, Julia Cook has some cute ones in her books where like you do push, pull, dangle. Like you push down on your chair as hard as you can, you pull up on your chair as hard as you can, and then you dangle, and the idea is, okay, now my body feels calmer and better. So my brain is ready to work. The problem is still the problem, but
Yeah.
it's a little distant. It's not quite as large. And then I asked them, does it seem as large? You're all freaking out about this, this final that you just found out about, or this term paper, or this canceled trip, or whatever. Does it seem as big as before we started? And then I just throw that in and then I go on with the lesson. Like it's like a little nugget. And then I go on with the lesson.
I like that. I've not heard of those before in relation to being able to address tension in the room, to have that physical. I've done the brain gym activities when students get tired or disinterested or you've been sitting for too long, but I like connecting it to something that is causing them some tension within the room to handle it a little bit differently.
Yeah. I like to really remind them that anger identifies a problem. Problems are things with solutions, right? Every problem has a solution. Therefore, people can't be problems because people can't be solved.
Oh, I like that.
So the fight is not you versus me, like you cheated, you didn't cheat. The problem becomes one of difference of opinions regarding the rules,
I like that.
right? Or difference of opinions regarding how we measure what constitutes out or not,
Nice. Yes.
right? Well, that's really what we're arguing about. Or like insufficient resources, right? One court, two classes that both want it.
Right.
So this is not a class B is a terrible class and we're class A and we hate them. This is we only have one court that two classes want to use. What's an equitable way that we can figure this out for the future so that we don't waste every single recess fighting over the court.
Right. Nice. And then when you think about teachers having trauma and being able to manage the stress and emotions that they are going through, how can teachers manage their own traumas and stresses so that it does not affect their teaching?
So I think the first thing is going back to this, teachers are just grown-up kids, right?
Yep.
I think in the 80s, we did a lot of like defining trauma out of existence. Like, oh, I'm not traumatized. It wasn't that bad. I'm fine. And we thought that that was healthy and strong. That's not healthy and strong. If you don't have emotions, your emotions have you, right?
Yeah.
If you're feeling traumatized and you're feeling stressed, I think as a responsible teacher who really wants to connect, you have to make yourself available to be present. If you're present with your trauma, you're not present with your students. And that means handling and addressing your trauma. That might mean going to therapy. That might mean journaling. That might mean talking it out with, some sort of an advisor who isn't like a formal therapist. But the idea is because trauma does happen in the future, you might suddenly become traumatized by something that happened years ago and now you're overwhelmed. Talking it through, sorting that through in your brain, taking that experience that's too big to metabolize and breaking it down and digesting it means that experience doesn't have to keep knocking at the door. Something I show adults a lot is, the beginning of the Harry Potter movie when they're trying to deliver the letter from Hogwarts to Harry Potter.
Yeah.
So they're trying to deliver the letter and Harry has this evil uncle that doesn't want to let the letter get delivered. So the uncle like nails down the mailbox. So then it starts coming in through the chimney. So he nails shut the chimney. So it starts coming in through the window, right? And because it's a magical letter, it has, many, many, many ways to come in. When you don't
Yes.
want to accept the letter is going to keep on coming. If you just open the door and take the letter stops coming. So if trauma is knocking at your door saying like, hi, I'm here, let it in and be like, yeah, that was messed up. There are people who are right now becoming traumatized about COVID
Wow.
because we were in survival mode for a lot of families. And it was just like weird, like, oh my gosh, where's my next paycheck coming from? How am I working and having my kids home and managing their education and managing all of these stressors? And then like the world went back to normal. And now that their brains feel safe, they're saying like, suddenly now they're feeling all this tension and stress that they didn't feel because now they're safe enough to feel it.
You just get into that survival mode, like your autopilot. You just get through. And then when you're done with it, all of a sudden it's like now you're tired, now you're exhausted, now you're looking back going, how did I ever do that? And it's that survival mode. And then that reflection, that moment when you get to kind of like, oh my gosh, I'm going to finally stop for a moment, then it seems to catch up with you.
Yeah. And that's when you have to do something about it.
You have a book called Post-Traumatic Parenting, and you teach parents how to handle their own life's traumas so they can model great resilience for their own children. And so can you talk about the concept of post-traumatic parenting and then your hopes for the future?
Yeah, so post-traumatic parenting is, like I said, the book that I wanted to read when I became a mom. I remember when I gave birth to my oldest daughter, and right, I'm a clinical child psychologist, and I remember the nurses in the hospital saying to me, like, oh my gosh, wow, she's the luckiest kid in the world. She's being raised by someone who, like, literally at that point, I was doing research on temperament-based parenting. And I remember having this thought of like, poor kid, she has me for a mom, and my PTSD, like my damage, is definitely going to damage her. So I needed this book. So when I was working on the book, I started to realize that trauma does impact our parenting in certain specific and predictable ways. But when we acknowledge those ways, and when we actively and mindfully say, oh, that's the trauma app in my brain that was born from my trauma. It's trying to make me feel safe again. And therefore, it's making me do these parenting behaviors that I know are inconsistent with my values.
Oh.
So I need to recognize the trauma app, recognize what it's doing, and sort of shut off its permissions, because I will make me feel safe again. Like, to give a concrete example, I had this with a mom who herself was a literacy educator, and her son was dyslexic. And she became obsessed with teaching him how to read. So she was drilling and killing phonics, and she knew that this is not how our brains learn. Like, there's a point where his brain has reached saturation. I've got to let him be a kid. I've got to let him play. But her trauma app in her brain was, there's a problem, fix it, close the tab, make it better. This has to stop, because her trauma taught her that when there's a problem, you have to solve it immediately. So she was relating to her son as a problem instead of her son as a dyslexic child who will eventually learn how to read, but it's going to be a bumpy road, because when you have this, particularly, he had surface dyslexia, which meant phonics instruction anyway wasn't going to work, but that was a separate conversation. But her brain was like, anytime she wasn't trying to actively teach him how to read, she felt panicky. Like, she could be making dinner, which is what a mom should be doing, and she's feeling guilty because she's not drilling him reading right now.
Yeah.
Because her trauma app was like, if he can't read by the time he's a grown up, really bad things are going to happen. Like, he's in second grade. Children grow up slowly. You have time. There are many, many, many paths to reading. He will learn how to read, particularly if you don't make it noxious and you don't drill and kill, and you work with him and you work with a reading specialist. You'll get there. But her trauma app couldn't let her let it go. And she knew this. She was so frustrated with herself. And that's where we go, oh, this is not you. It's your trauma.
Right.
You're not parenting your kid right now. Your trauma is.
You're not teaching your child, your trauma is. That's pretty profound. I look at ACEs and I think to myself, it's life. We don't get out of life without events when it comes down to death, possibly poverty. There's so many different parts that we at some point come to.
Yeah, I think there's also, in the book, I have a chapter on something I call S-ACEs, which is secret ACEs. So there's a lot of things that aren't on the ACE list that are just as traumatic. You know, having really critical and cold parents, having a parent who's a functional alcoholic. So, right, there's no poverty. And in fact, the family looks perfect on the surface. Right. But does that home feel safe? If we think of the 4 S's of attachment, right? We want our kids to feel safe, soothed, seen, and secure.
Yeah.
Does the child have any of those things in a home with a functional alcoholic for a parent? But it's secret, because nobody's in prison and no one's in poverty and nobody's, we haven't moved 6 times and nobody's beating anybody, maybe with words, maybe behind closed doors, but there's no safety in that home. Everybody's walking on eggshells. Everybody's scurrying around being afraid to be seen. That child can also be traumatized. We can see the ACEs, right?
Yeah.
Very often you look at a family and you see a kid who comes to school with a bruise, there's trauma there.
Right.
Assuming it's not like a bruise from gymnastics, but that somebody was beating that kid and we can mobilize.
Yeah.
Do you see those invisible bruises of, my mom just subjected me to a tirade for an hour about not, washing the dishes precisely the way she wanted them washed, and told me that I'm like a waste of oxygen and she wishes she never gave birth to me and I'm in 3rd grade? You're not going to see those bruises.
No, you're not. So silent ACEs. There's a lot of good stuff in your book. It comes out next year?
It comes out in 2025. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And there's an ebook right now?
So now I have an ebook just to start people off on managing your trauma, just like a post-traumatic parent survival guide, like the way you start. Because I think for a lot of people, it's traumatic to acknowledge that they're traumatized.
I would agree.
right?
Yes.
It's like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, that was so messed up. I've had this in so many parenting classes where someone will say, or even when I go to a school and I'm speaking about trauma, and a teacher will come up to me and she'll say, "Yeah, let's say my mom telling me that I'm a waste of space in third grade. Now that I teach third graders are really little.
Yeah.
Like, I wouldn't speak that way to a third grader. Does that mean I'm traumatized?" And it's like, you actually just became traumatized when you realized that that was very messed up.
Yeah.
And no, you're not a waste of space. And your mom should not have said that to you. That's not okay. And now we can start the healing process.
You have so many different things that you do to support and educate parents and teachers. Your website, you have not only your therapy practice, you've got classes, target parenting, target teaching, seminars that you offer. You've got your ebook, so you have to tell us how to get the ebook. You also have a podcast on post-traumatic parenting, and you've got a YouTube channel. So how can people find it?
So the podcast and the YouTube channel are both post-traumatic parenting. So there's a theme here.
Yeah.
So they can just find it like that.
Yep.
My website is drrobynkoslowitz.com. When you go to the website, I'm pretty sure there's a pop-up that says if you sign up for our newsletter, you get the free ebook. I'm also on Instagram at Dr. Koslowitz Psychology. And that's really where the post-traumatic parenting community hangs out.
Oh, good.
I have much more one-on-one interaction with people, like through the DMs, through the posts. It's also where I go to let people ask me questions, and that generates what we're actually talking about. Like, how do I handle my 5-year-old who's way too exuberant, so that we can give those answers from that post-traumatic parenting lens? Because I find that post-traumatic parents really struggle with, I don't want to be punitive like my parents, but on the other hand, I do have to teach my child skills on how to handle life. So how do I manage that? Because my trauma app is like, oh no, you're heading into like abusive territory. Don't ever do that. So how do we balance that?
Right. I would like to end with your words. Our traumas can either be our greatest problem or our greatest superpower. Knowing how to relate to our trauma can help us grow as people and as parents. And I found a lot of hope in those words. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about trauma and to give us all of your insights.
Thank you so much for having me. I love the way your podcast really helps teachers who are just passionate about education and want to keep doing it better and better, because I feel like the teachers want to be able to succeed. We just have to give them the tools and free them up to be able to do that.
If you have a story about what's working in your schools that you'd like to share, you can email me at lisa@drlisarhassler.com or visit my website at www.drlisarhassler.com and send me a message. If you like this podcast, subscribe and tell a friend. The more people that know, the bigger impact it will have. And if you find value to the content in this podcast, consider becoming a supporter by clicking on the supporter link in the show notes. It is the mission of this podcast to shine light on the good in education so that it spreads, affecting positive change. So let's keep working together to find solutions that focus on our children's success.